I'd like to thank everybody who's been instrumental in bringing me here. There's an enormous army of people in CISCO and the CSI, and particularly for all the people that I've had a chance to meet. We were with Terry Moran yesterday at PM&C, Jeff Harcher, and with Malcolm Turnbull on Monday. It's been great to get around and get a sense for your challenges here. Contrary to what Martin was saying, I probably won't touch too much on progressive conservatism as an ideology unless you want me to, which you can talk about in the Q&A, because my experience of talking to public servants is that when you talk about political ideology, they get very worried and they will run for the hills. So I won't touch on those things unless you're interested in finding out about them. I'm very happy to talk about them if you want to. Although the bulk of what I'm going to say has a really big bearing on what drives our thinking in the Progressive Conservatism Project. Now, the last time I spoke to a big group of people was a group of Japanese policymakers, and I had a few gags that I'd thought I'd throw in to sort of warm the crowd up, but I wasn't sure whether the jokes would translate. So beforehand, I got the translator and I said, look, I wonder if this is going to work. Let me just try one out on you. So I gave it to him, and he was dead-faced, and he said, okay, it's fine, yeah, it'll work. So, okay, went up there, started my little speech. About a minute in, I thought, okay, I'll throw in the joke. Little pause while the man next to me translated it. And then suddenly all the Japanese fell around in hysterical laughter, holding their sides. Oh, I didn't realise it was that funny. Fine. And so I thought I'd throw in a few more, and every time the same thing happened. And at the end, I said to him, oh, gosh, thank you so much. You obviously did a brilliant job on the translating. They seem to love the jokes. They obviously work really well in Japanese. And he said, no. The jokes did not work in Japanese, nor were they funny even in English. So what I said was, when you told the joke, I turned to them and I said, he has told a joke, he thinks it's funny, he'd like you to laugh. So I hope that this isn't lost in translation in the same sense. So I'm just going to structure the talk today, talk to you about three things. So first, I'll briefly frame the problem as I see it. We've already had a great articulation of it by Peter and John, so I'll just be quite brief on that. Then I move on to what I would perceive as the how we answer that challenge, and I'll do a little bit on the intellectual framework, but then most of what I want to do is on the final third, which will be on how we actually do these things in practice, because I always hate to go to a seminar where I don't come away knowing an email I need to write or a thing I need to actually do. So I'll try and keep it quite practical for you, and then leave plenty of time for your questions. So John spoke about our big, hairy, audacious goals, and I think I'm trying to push us towards a big, hairy, audacious goal too. And our goal at the Progressive Conservatism Project is really the end of bureaucracy, a concept of owning government. We sometimes call it human government. And this is a pretty challenging thing. We all go into the public service because we care about making a difference, as well as the fact it's intellectually interesting. But so often we're frustrated by what we come up against in our day-to-day lives, the meetings and the reports we have to read, and the sheer slowness of the whole system. I get a powerful sense from the people that I work with in Westminster that they love the idea of their work and they often don't enjoy the actual work so much. So the title of the debate for today is on Resuscitating Democracy, which is a pamphlet I wrote. Most of it was about parliamentary democracy, but really what I want to get across is the idea of creating a democracy where democracy is much more than just voting. It's about participation and an ownership of government all the way through, from the beginning of an idea through to its implementation. So just start by talking a little bit about why that's such an important idea, why we have to move to this concept of human government. For me, it comes from two reasons. One is there's a sort of triple crunch of problems that we're facing at the moment. We're aware of the credit crunch. We're fully up to date on that. And there's a whole set of problems that come with the recession, aside from the causes, the financial causes, dole queues, all the rest of it. We're very familiar with that. So we've got a big challenge in the next couple of years. I think Australia's weathered the recession rather better than Britain, but certainly across the world, there's public service challenges. Fine, we know that kind of stuff. The second of the triple crunches, I would say, is about the long-term mega challenges that we've been facing for ages. Beveridge in 1948 talked about his 5 giants of want and hunger and so on. We've almost got 5 giants again now. And these are things that, as public servants, you'll be well aware of, well worked. There's plenty of reports already on them. But I think they're really reaching a moment of fruition. So they are things like, for example, the aging population. We know this has been happening for ages. But this year, people who were born in 1945 are going to turn 65, start drawing their pensions. So there's a sort of sharp acceleration in the burden it's going to place on us fiscally. Behavioural and chronic health conditions. In Britain, The cost of the NHS is estimated to go up by between 4 and 7 times by 2035. Where are we going to find that money? And that obviously feeds into an ageing society. We've got problems of globalization and where Britain and other countries fit in the world, a world of new rising powers. We've got problems of international development. And we've got problems of political trust. There's been a complete collapse, in Britain at least, of trust in politicians. I think politicians were never the most popular people. Usually they were just ahead of journalists, but that was about it. Now, I think that the journalists have gone slightly higher up the hierarchy, and the only reason why politicians are not at the bottom is that the bankers have replaced them. So there's a real crisis of legitimacy in the whole process of government and politics, in my country at least. So that's the second of our triple crunches, these mega challenges which come together at the same time. They've been ticking away for ages, but now I think those bombs are about to explode. And the third is that just when we need to deal with these two big challenges, we don't have any money. In fact, we have quite a lot less than no money. Having no money would be marvellous. We've got I think, this year, £178 billion budget gap. So that, I think, latest estimates is about £1.7 trillion of money we don't have. So to give you a sense of that challenge, somebody's worked out that if you stacked £5 notes end to end, this would go to the moon and back. Those kind of statistics, all those mad sort of things. So we've really got to start doing more for less. Everybody knows this kind of mantra, but it really is pressing now. I think politics is full of these kind of false dawns and big rhetorical speeches. But now, I think, for once, it is actually true. We really are facing severe challenge. We've got to start doing things differently. And we're not talking about getting 5% more efficient. We're not talking about a slight headcount reduction to meet these sort of challenges. If your health budget is going to be going up by 7 times over the next generation, then you need to start thinking about doing something a completely different way. We need to be getting 50% more efficient, not 5%. So that means not doing the old thing better. It means doing a new thing. And so that's one of the big drivers of why we need to start thinking about reform. But I think the other is that we have known about this and we have tried to do it. It's not like government, at least in Britain, since the 1980s, hasn't tried to reform public services. We've had non-stop public service reform. And particularly since Tony Blair came to power in 1997, we had a Prime Minister who had an enormous public support, had a massive parliamentary majority, the second biggest in British history. We had all the learned reports you could possibly want. You had a brilliant team of advisors. Jeff Mulgan, Tom was around at that time too, many other people in the room. Had some brilliant advisors. We had the talents of a hugely politically talented Prime Minister. And perhaps most importantly of all, we had a booming economy and a massive slug of public spending money. Now, despite all that, although we've seen some improvements in outcomes, so I wouldn't deny that at all, there have been many good things, we haven't seen the level of improvement that we were hoping for. And in some cases, things have gone backwards. So we need to think in a different way, because just trying to brain it out with clever policymakers isn't going to work, because we have tried and it didn't. So why have we failed? I think we've failed because we fundamentally had the wrong approach to government. We need to think in a different way. And this approach that we previously had was a kind of commodity view of what the state did. The state was basically modelled, it was a model adapted from industry. We weren't talking about lumps of steel or bags of grain or something, but we were still talking about commodities, be they exam grades or hip replacements. And when we adopted that model, we were basically looking back to the model that Henry Ford used in the 1920s. And Ford's system was characterized by 4 characteristics. The first was that there was a strict separation between producer and consumer. The guy who designed the Model T, he designed it, somebody else built it. The consumer had no involvement in that process except the choice to buy the car or not to buy the car. That's all they've got. The second was that every product was standardized. You know, you can have it any color you like as long as it's black, and to reduce costs. The third was that the workmen on the production line play no part in it aside from doing their bit of drilling or painting or whatever it was. They're not asked for their opinion on how to improve it. And the final was that the entire system was run and overseen by a group of centrally controlling managers. And if you think about it, this is exactly the way that we run many public services. We treat public service as a sort of customer industry. We treat citizens as customers, and that sounds nice, but actually it means that we treat them as passive recipients of what we are giving them. And we tend to give them a standardized product, and we tend to assume that if it's, say, a hip replacement, that the Department of Health officials will know better than the doctors who are doing it, certainly better than the patient who's receiving it. I think that this model, which was adapted into public service, is fundamentally mistaken. I mean, in a way, it's fine, because actually it is quite a good model if you want to produce a commodity. And so we've got pretty good, I would say. We're sort of down on the problems of commodity difficulties like volume, burglary, that sort of thing. We're actually quite fast at treating people who come in for a hip replacement. We're not too bad at those problems. Those were problems perhaps 30, 40 years ago, but we've actually kind of cracked the efficient delivery of welfare payments and things like that to a reasonable degree. Room for improvement, but we're sort of there. But the problem is that all the big challenges that are fueling our triple crunch, none of those are really commodity problems. They're all human problems. They're about relationships and atmosphere. So, for example, although it's great if we can get kids to get good exam grades, that's not really what we want them to get. We really want them to get a love of learning and a sense of fulfillment and excitement about the future. Although we might say that we want to do a hip replacement, more broadly, we really want people to stay healthy. And in fact, there's a symbiotic relationship between these two factors, because if you spend more time doing some of the softer stuff, you might not need to spend so much time doing some of the harder stuff. For example, if you're focusing on community policing and building strong relationships with the community, you might not need so much of the hard stuff, the arrests, in the first place. So the challenge is that we've created a system which is not set up to dealing with those kind of problems, and so by and large, those are the ones that are growing fast that we can't deal with, people who are addicted, people who can't control their own behavior. So how do we get to this kind of human state, this human government? I think that the first most important thing to bear in mind is that the best policymakers, the best ministers, are clueless. They don't know what they're talking about. That's what we want to aim to become. Because really we need to have a humility about what we could possibly know about these human problems, what's happening at the coalface. We can be pretty expert and rely on technical expertise when we're trying to do something efficiently like brain surgery, which is a kind of commodity output. But when we're trying to get people to keep themselves healthy, we probably can't devise a clever enough plan to make that happen. So we need to be humble about what we could possibly achieve from the centre. And so this, I think the answer, the kind of big idea behind all this, is a concept of real democracy. Democracy which is not just about voting, but which is about control and participation and a voice in all parts of public life. And that's what I mean when we talk about owning government. And I think there's a huge appetite for that. I know you have compulsory voting here, but in Britain we've seen pretty low, horribly low, really, turnouts in elections. Real democracy, I think, is vibrant, but official democracy is dying. It's dying across the Western world, really. We had, I think, 18% turnout in our last local elections in May. 18%. That is rubbish. So it's easy to look at this and think, actually, people don't care about politics. They're not interested in it. But, of course, we know, as Peter was pointing out, that there's a huge political activism, a real resurgence, a renaissance of political activism that's been going on over the last decade or two. You see it in everything from the organic food movement to blogs to marches against the war in Iraq. People are highly politicized at the moment, I would say. But it depends on your definition of politics. And as Peter was pointing out, I would agree with you that everything from running a tennis club up to standing for Parliament is a political activity. So what we need to do is find a way to tap into that political activism and to bring it into the formal structures of government, not to tame it, not to constrain it, but rather really to perhaps to make official political government subservient to that instinct so that we can really harness it and use it to drive a better society. So that's kind of the theoretical problem and the theoretical framework to answer it. I want to spend most of my time talking about practical ways we can do this, because that's where the real interest is, I feel. So how do we actually build a human government? I think there's a couple of pretty straightforward and proven things that we can do that are challenging to our minds, but they aren't challenging to execute. So one is that we need to be open about the answer. Often we've got quite a clear idea of the question. We should be open about the answer. And so you might see this, for example, in the open procurement movement, sometimes called Iterative Commissioning. An example was that this is where you say, look, I know exactly what I want to get to, I just don't know how. So, for example, the British government recently, we were having lots of soldiers killed in urban warfare by roadside bombs in Afghanistan. And we basically didn't really know what to do about this. Now, an old-fashioned approach would have been say, right, well, we need new body armor and we need a new jeep or something. Or even perhaps to go out there on a fact-finding mission and speak to soldiers and ask them what they thought you needed and then come back and procure that. But the best way would be to just say, look, we want a solution that will stop soldiers being killed, and there's a £40 million contract for anybody who can provide that. So this is what they did. And actually, apparently they had to go back to the Treasury and say, look, we've had so many good entries, we'd like to give 2 or 3 first prizes, where we'd like to procure a number of these solutions because we've had so many good solutions come out of that process. So being open about the method, even if you're clear on the direction. And obviously that's buying a physical thing, but actually this works when you're buying, when you want to procure something more insubstantial. So for example, Nesta, our innovation agency, just ran a competition called the Big Green Challenge, and this was to cut carbon use in remote locations in rural villages. So they knew that's what they wanted to do. They didn't really know how to do it. So they said, right, we've got, I think, £2 million is how much they had. They split it in two. £1 million is going to be the first prize. The rest is going to be used for giving out any smaller prizes and business advice along the way. So invite anybody to come forward with ideas of how they could reduce carbon in their village. And then they gave them, they didn't have to already have done it. They gave them a little bit of money to help them work up the business plan. And then they take top 500 or something through to the next round. And they get a little bit more help and a little bit more money. And they keep going through until they end up with a single winner. Now, obviously, that's great because you get a really good finished product, but and it probably comes from a place you weren't expecting. But you also, along the way, generate many other competition participants who've got new energy, new ideas. They've attracted new volunteers to their cause, and they've got quite a lot of help, which might enable them to get further funding later on. So check out their website because they have extensive stats on how it helped all the people who didn't win the competition as well as the ones who did. So that kind of concept of open procurement, I think, is one with a lot of possibility for the future. The second technique is really rich feedback. The Blair government had a big push on voice. Voice was one of the buzzwords, voice and choice. I think partly chosen because they rhyme nicely. But voice in the turn of the noughties was seen as a big future direction for public services. If you could only hear what service users really wanted, that would help enable to make a better service. But the problem was that the technology for capturing voice was pretty limited. You had to have big consultation exercises which got a snapshot sort of view of what people were thinking, and it didn't really work. It's not real voice. But luckily now, within just a few years, it was only basically a few years too early, because within a few years it became very easy to express your opinion online and capture opinions in that way. And so this is being done practically in lots of different ways across public service. One example is rich feedback that enables you to make a better decision, like Patient Opinion. It's a website where you can leave comments about your hospital experience. And the guy who runs it was telling me that there had been one, I think it was a stroke ward, where they were finding that the loos, this isn't very nice, by the way, you might want to put your fingers in the ears, the loos were getting really messy. And they couldn't really work out why it was that there was such a mess being made in them. And they would ask the patients, why? And the patient would say, oh, nothing, it wasn't me. But through Patient Opinion, people felt they could comment anonymously on there and explain the problem. The problem was that if you're partially paralyzed because you've just had a stroke, they couldn't reach over to get to the loo roll, which is only on one side, if they were paralyzed on that side of the body. And so the solution was to fit another loo roll holder on the other side. And this saved them about £800 a week in cleaning. So that cost 20p. So we can get to much better public service outcomes just by harnessing feedback like that. Another technique, which is a little bit more adventurous, and I like it, is something like the iBerg application that Pittsburgh has developed. This is something that goes on your iPhone, and as you're walking down the street, you can say, there's a pothole, you give it a geotag, it's here. You don't have to do anything else from there on. The city gets knowledge. If you're taking a kind of broken window theory approach to crime, you want to crack down on graffiti and broken curbs and all these kind of things, then this is a great breakthrough because it basically enables citizens to be your eyes and ears out there for what needs doing, as well as helping you track the volume of demand in different areas. So you might think, oh, there's an awful lot of people complaining about vermin in that area. Maybe I ought to get the rubbish guys and the vermin guys down there. Or you can go even further with these kind of feedback mechanisms. Because I think that one of the big problems that we've faced is a tyranny of evidence-based policy. I am not a big fan of evidence-based policy. Well, in a way I am. It's just the type of evidence that we take tends to be purely quantitative, and it tends to be evidence which is easy to get, not the right thing to measure. And so by focusing very harshly on evidence-based policy, then what you really get is narrowly evidence-based policy. Added to which, of course, it's terrible for innovation, because how can you possibly have substantial evidence of something which is new? So this is something we've really got to fight back against, I think. And by using techniques like patient opinion, then you can get a much richer type of feedback, include all the qualitative comments which previously were so hard to capture, and start to move towards a situation where systems are really much more participative in shaping new policy. And the ultimate evolution of that might be something, I mean, this is a bit fiery, even for me, like New Zealand's attempt to write their last police act in 2007, I think it was, which they drafted, people are nodding, yeah, they drafted, tell me if I got this right, they drafted the full bill in the normal way that they would do it. They did all policy like they would normally do it. And then they put the act up on a wiki for, I think, 9 months. Yes, that's right. And anybody could edit it as long as they had a New Zealand passport number. And they took it down and put it to their parliament. So that's just I mean, that's quite bold, but that gives you an idea of where we could head with building in user participation and information and their insights into public policy. The third technique that I think really helps you get to human government is to free up the front line. Teachers and doctors know why they came into public service, and they know what is needed in that classroom or in that case. Now, the problem is that when we give frontline loads and loads of freedom, we're worried that they might abuse it, that there might be a dodgy doctor, there might be a rubbish teacher. Now, there's a couple of different techniques to get around this, I think. One is something like a choice-based mechanism. I think that works well in education. The Conservative Party and Liberal Democrats in Britain are proposing a sort of free choice system, Swedish schools they call it, because this is the system they have in Sweden. And in that system, basically, teachers can do pretty much what they want in classroom, and ultimate evolution of it would be that the curriculum would be very free too. And if it's not what parents want, then they won't go to that, they won't send their kids to that school, and the school won't flourish, and eventually it will have to close. Now, the problem is that some people can exercise choice much better than others. So there are little tweaks you can use to get around that, and one of the ones that's being proposed in Britain at the moment is a pro-poor pupil premium, so that the voucher size that you're giving to children from the poorest decile is much bigger than that of children in the top decile. And therefore, when a school is presented with two kids who are of the same intellectual standard and energy, then you probably go for the one from the poorer background, whereas at the moment, it's very much the case that you wouldn't do that, and the poorest kids tend to go to the worst schools. So that kind of stuff works, and some choice-based systems work in some cases, partly to drive up efficiency, but I think the main benefit is that they allow teachers to do what they want because you can be much more hands-off about top-down control of them. That doesn't work everywhere, though. Some systems are not very susceptible to choice. Police and justice are examples, and arguably I would say health might be too. But in that case, you can go down a different route, which is transparency. And a good example of this is heartsurgery.chq.org, I think it is, which is, we had a scandal in Britain about 4 years ago, where the Guardian newspaper uncovered that there was an unusually high number of deaths. I think it was at Bristol Royal Infirmary. And they trying to work out why, and they were besieging the state with FOI requests, Freedom of Information requests. And as a result of uncovering this scandal, it was decided that we're going to publish mortality data, survival rate data, for thoracic surgeons, not just on a hospital-by-hospital basis, but actually on a surgeon-by-surgeon basis. So it's possible now to know whether the surgeon who's about to operate on you kills more or less of his patients than the average. It's adjusted for risk factors, like if you're operating on older people as a rule and things like that. And as a result of doing that, not only do you eliminate malpractice pretty quickly, because nobody wants to be the guy who's known as being Dr. Death, but you also allow the spread of best practice and new ideas to flourish, because people want to know, why is your rate so high? How can I get to that? So the survival rate has moved from 93% surviving up to 98% surviving in about 5 years, which is better than both the EU and US average. So that's an example of how you can still free the front line, and you don't have to necessarily have lots of top-down controls to ensure that they're doing the right thing. The fourth technique, I think, to get to human government is we talked a little bit earlier about how it's important to be open to the idea that you don't know the answer, but you still might know the question. In fact, I think if you want to be really bold, then you need to be open to the idea that you don't know the question or the answer. And there are a number of techniques which are harnessing that, which I think have been really powerful and offer perhaps the most opportunity for the future. So one of those is connected to transparency, data release. In the situation of the heart surgery data, we thought that information was quite useful, and we were releasing it for a purpose. But if we go out and are bold about releasing data, we often find it has many unexpected purposes we never even thought of. An example of this was a website called Access City, which was hacked together in a weekend by something called the Social Innovation Camp in the UK. I think there's one starting here in Australia too. Social Innovation Camp is a great idea. Basically, you submit ideas for what you would like to do that needs a technical solution, and you're not necessarily a techie, and then a whole bunch of techies turn up for the weekend, and they help you build the solution that weekend, there and then. So somebody had an idea. They said, look, if you're in a wheelchair, it's pretty hard to get around town because the brakes and the curb aren't very evenly distributed, and sometimes you need to go a kind of long way round to get to. When all this data was published, they were able to take that data and hack it together with Google Maps and create a system which prints out a map for you if you're in a wheelchair to say, this is the quickest way from A to B by going by the dips and the curbs. Now, I would never, ever have thought that that data on where the dips and the curves was useful. It's not really useful to me. But there are people out there who do find these things useful. So we need to be open-minded about the idea that just because we don't think it's something that could possibly have a good use, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a good use. And taking that idea on, we could go to ideas like a scheme we proposed recently called whydon'twe.gov. The idea was that we want to tap into people's innovation, get them to be part of public service delivery. We tend to get people involved in democratic process in just one of 4 chunks. I think there's sort of 4 stages to an idea. You have coming up with the idea or the problem, then you have working out an answer to deal with it, then you have a sort of choice phase where you vote on whether it's a good idea or some kind of method of making a choice, and then the final phase you implement it. And we typically only involve people in the third of those 4 phases, the voting one. We don't involve them in coming up with new ideas or spotting the problems or implementing policy or anything like that. So a technique to do that would be something like whydon'twe.gov, where the idea is that anybody can suggest a solution to an improvement to public service of any kind. It doesn't have to be restricted to health or to education or whatever. It can be from any sector. And you can be a citizen, you can be a public service professional, it could be anybody. And the community then rates the ideas in the same way that you do when you're rating stars on eBay or Amazon or that sort of thing. And you then take the top, you could say top 5 a week or a month. And those people who get into the top 5, top 10, whatever it might be, they get the right to meet the minister in the area concerned. The minister has to respond to their query by, you might do it by YouTube, that would be quite short and easy for the minister, if they're accepting or rejecting it. And if your idea is taken on, then you win £1,000. And the idea is really not so much that you're going to get lots of good ideas, although I think you would, but that you're going to create that sense that you can be part of government. It's something you can influence. It's not something that's done to you. We talked a lot about technology, but this isn't just restricted to technology. In fact, it's got applications for a much wider range of things in the social sphere outside that. Just going to have some water. It's quite hot up here. I should be like Kennedy with a pancake, not like Nixon. So one technique you can use is participatory budgeting, which you might have heard about. I think it is used in Australia in some places, but last night it didn't. Quite a few people hadn't heard of it. So PB is the idea that you take a chunk of money and you have a kind of X Factor type event where you say, right, we've got £100,000 we're giving away today at the town hall. Come along, give a pitch for your idea. At the end of the afternoon, we'll be voting on whose idea deserves the money. This has been tried in local authorities up and down the UK and increasingly abroad. In Brazil, I can't remember the name of the city, but if Jeff Mulgan was here, he would name it because he always mentions it. There's a city which does up to 60% of its budgeting by participatory budgeting. Yeah, that place. So this is something that's really taking off. And in fact, in San Diego, they've just decided to do participatory cuts for their budget, where they put the entire budget online and said, look, we are in deficit, so you tell us what you think we should cut. So participatory budgeting is another technique where you can get a bit closer to that form of human government. And the final technique I'd talk about is social design, which is the evolution of the design thinking that John was picking up on, which is just starting to come through into public policy in the UK, and I think a little bit in Australia. Social design takes the techniques and methods that designers use, product designers or service designers, and often also mixes them with the techniques of ethnography or anthropology, and then goes and lives the life of the target group you're trying to help. So it might be single mums, it might be disabled people. There's a whole variety of different groups you might want to target. Here, perhaps indigenous communities. And the aim is that you by living with them and seeing with the eyes of an anthropologist, you're able to get a clearer idea on what their real problems are. And by working with the designers, you're able to construct a process, not just where you create a better policy for them, but actually where you coach them and set up a framework for them to be the authors of their own new policy. And this is an infinitely better system, to my mind. Not only is it very empowering, because the thing that you create as a group of single mums or as a group of wheelchair users or whoever it might be, the thing that you create, you own. You created it. And you feel a sense of ownership over it. That means you protect it, you use it. It tends to be much more efficient because you're cutting out all the services which you don't really need, and you're only putting in the services that you do need. And typically, it's something which gets to a different service, a new answer, and it can be a lot more innovative. So social design is something that's really been taking off in the UK recently, and I'd encourage you to have a look at some of the web links that I think we're going to circulate afterwards. Okay, so just to close, I think there's still a strong role for government in this. When I was over at PM&C yesterday, they were a bit spiked by the idea that we were going to turn government inside out and there was no need for civil servants anymore. I think there definitely still is. I mean, obviously there's a role in tax collection, and there's many ministries where this doesn't work, in defence or many other sectors. But even given that, there's still a role for government as a framework, as a platform. In the same way that the iPhone is not a very good phone, doesn't have a very good battery life, it's not that clear to hear on, I think. But it's a platform which you can then populate with things that make it incredibly useful. That's how government needs to evolve to become. It needs to be a framework, a platform which provides flexible funding, provides support, maybe convenes people, but it's not necessarily the doer, because Steve Jobs, brilliant as he is, could never have designed the million applications that people have used to make the iPhone something really interesting and useful. Connected to that idea of the framework, there's methods of social return on investment, cashback perhaps. We've been looking at some estates in Birmingham which grassroots movements have been working on. It's an interesting story because there was a brilliant scheme set up by the Blair government in 1997. It's called New Deal for Communities. And the idea was that you would give a large amount of money, pretty much no strings attached, and the community would spend it on what they thought was useful to regenerate the most deprived areas in Britain. Sounds like a pretty good idea. It's the kind of policy I would have written if I was writing it 10 years ago. What actually happened was that this is a lot of money they're spending, about £50 million on a group of usually about 8,000 people over 10 years. What happened was that the communities usually couldn't spend that amount of money. They didn't have the capabilities, the social capital. They didn't have the financial management to spend so much money. They had to bring in external experts to help them, and in fact, they ended up running the program. Now, if there are British policy experts here, they probably dispute that kind of rather sweeping categorization of New Deal for Communities. It has had some successes, but by and large, that's been the story there. Instead, we're looking at some estates which weren't New Deal for Communities areas, but were very deprived, where neighbourhood activism really got involved, and not even charities. They were just groups of neighbours who decided they were going to do something about the graffiti, the needles, the dog poo, all the rest of the problems that were afflicting their area. And back of the envelope, I wouldn't like to be held to this, but back of the envelope, I think that they have saved over a decade about £180 million in an area of 10,000 people for the taxpayer. Yet they can't keep their community centres open for want of £10,000 or £15,000. So how does that work? So there's interesting things that we can do to work to try and provide funding solutions up front by offering cash back for people who are doing something which might save the state money in the future. And the third thing we can do in the framework is to make it easy for social innovators. It is not easy for social innovators out there at the moment. It really isn't. We're talking to a Bristol Drugs Action team. They said that they had to interface with 82 different agencies or people within agencies who all had their own rules and targets for the funding that they were acquiring, which meant that they spent no more than about 40% of their time actually tackling drug addiction. We've got to do something about this kind of thing. Right, so I guess I would close by saying that this vision, when I've been going around talking to people about it this week in Australia, lots of people said, wow, that is really bold. This kind of idea of turning government inside out, these sort of techniques, that would be such a culture change for us. And I don't think it is that bold, really, because if you go on Spotify, then you don't have to listen to the music which somebody else has selected to you as the thing that you're going to have to listen to. You can listen to any music you want to on there. And if you're in business, more and more businesses are now trying this kind of technique. You might have read Wikinomics, and Don Tapscott has a lovely example of Goldcore, which is a Canadian mining company. Are you aware of that? Yeah, some nods. So Goldcore was this company which had pretty much run out of gold seams in its area and offered a prize and published all its confidential data to see if anybody could find any new gold seams in their territory. And they didn't just have a few entries, they had thousands of entries from people combining all kinds of different techniques they'd never even thought of using before. And they didn't just find gold. I think they found 128 new seams of gold. The company went from being nearly bankrupt to being worth $9 billion. So this is happening in business, it's happening in our private life. Seems odd that it's not really happening in government yet, or not as much as it could do. So I think this agenda is it's exciting, it's morally right, this is the way that government ought to be, and I think it's very much possible. Thanks very much.